Okay. Hello, and welcome to Listen and Build, a mini series where Dr. Jeff Yip and I hear from experts about listening strategies in organizations or how leaders intentionally and strategically listen to employees to accomplish business goals, innovate, strengthen culture and connection, and build influence. So, for leaders, listening can happen in so many different ways. From a systematic, continuous listening platform with advanced analytics to organic one-on-one conversations with employees and everything in between. So our goal is to talk to leaders about how their approach to listening evolved over time and to help other leaders develop effective listening strategies. So today we are honored to be joined by Craig Starbuck. So Craig has built and led people analytics and employee listening teams at market leading companies, including Chime, Roku, Robinhood, and MasterCard. And he's currently the co-founder and CEO of OrgAcuity, an employee listening technology company. He's the author of the Fundamentals of People Analytics and president of the Society for People Analytics. Craig holds a PhD in organizational leadership and a BS in management information systems. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Alyssa.
Yeah, of course. Um, so we'd like to start off by learning a bit more about you and your perspective of the field. So you've spent over a decade building people analytics and employee listening functions across multiple companies. So how has your understanding of effective listening evolved over time? So what do you think it was earlier on, and what do you think about it now?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I entered the space back in 2015 as an owner of an employee listening program for the first time. And that's where I really went deep on kind of the state of employee listening technology and what vendors were doing in this space. Learned a lot more about the survey world. But prior to that, before jumping into HR, I experienced employee listening as an employee of an organization that was being asked to participate and take surveys, be it an annual engagement survey or a pulse survey or a departmental survey or something. And at the time, I would characterize listening as very episodic. It was very infrequent. I think at that time, early 2015, in most organizations, it was a once a year listening moment. And so it was this large lead up of, 3 months of planning and preparation. You launch the survey, typically open for 2 weeks, it closes, and then begins this long action planning cycle. And I was always kind of intrigued by that because I felt like by the time we actually started taking action, things had probably shifted, right? Because we're, several months removed from the actual listening moment, that the survey being live. And so over the past, 10 years that I've been in this space, I would say it really has changed from the perspective of we moved from like a once a year annual employee engagement survey to a more frequent and multi-channel listening strategy. And that looks different, of course, for different organizations. But I would say that the most common cadence I've seen is at least twice a year. So you might have like a larger annual engagement survey, a smaller, lighter weight mid-year pulse that really doesn't drive action. But then the multi-channel dimension is that, in addition to these large centrally owned surveys, there's other mechanisms to capture the voice of employees and start to make sense of their experience in between these biannual touch points.
Yeah, and just so we know briefly, because I know we'll get more into this, but what are some of those mechanisms that you have noticed?
Yeah, I think, focus groups are, a big one. And I'm excited to talk about some of the innovations in that space because focus groups, while really valuable in terms of like capturing rich qualitative context about, dynamics and, a certain part of an organization or better understanding, like double clicking on, listening scores, from like Likert type items, it's also very time intensive and administratively burdensome. And oftentimes, whether it's an HR business partner or some other role inside the people function, people don't have, time to facilitate those kind of semi-structured interviews. But even if you do, then we have like copious notes that were taken during these interviews. How do we analyze it all, right? And so like the pattern recognition piece. I think, AI lends well to that, and I'm sure we'll get into more of that in a bit. But I think focus groups are really important. I think of like surveys, at least the quantitative aspects of it is like the how and the where and the how often, but it doesn't tell us why. Like, why do people feel that way? And for the why, we really need that mixed methods approach where we're combining quantitative and qualitative. And, I think focus groups and some of these qualitative listening channels are really, they lend really nicely to that.
Mhm.
Yeah, Craig, I really appreciate how you talk about focus groups and both the how and the why and the full range of listening from quantitative to qualitative. I'm quite excited to dig deeper into that. As we're also quite interested in how listening can serve business outcomes. So before we dig into the specifics of how the hows and whys with listening, um, how do you see listening being strategic for organizations, and how do you see what's the business value of listening for organizations?
Yeah, I love this question. If it's okay, I'd like to share a story that
Mm,
I think will answer that question. Back in 2015, actually, so my very first role leading employee listening, um, employee listening was owned by HR compliance, and that was because there just wasn't a natural home for it. But they were very willing to give that up to an interested person who was going to like take that and run with that. So I was leading, I think we called it HR reporting and metrics at the time, like the equivalent of people analytics today. But I raised my hand because I saw kind of the adjacency of that, and like it would generate a lot of important data and like understanding and anticipating turnover and thing like different outcomes that we were looking at. So I raised my hand to take ownership of that. And after I did, we were running a quarterly pulse survey in the organization, like an enterprise-wide pulse survey. And I was asked to come and speak to our, C team, like our president, our CFO, our CIO, at an upcoming board meeting and go over the results with them. And so this was my first time ever presenting the results of employee engagement data. And so, I was a little nervous about it. I wasn't sure what to expect. And I was sitting there in the room. This is back when like we were all like physically together in the same room. I was sitting there at the table. I think maybe I was third on the agenda. And so for the first couple of topics, I was just kind of scanning the room and just watching nonverbals and learning like who's who and like who seems to have like the clout here and like who's like really well respected.
mm,
And this was an investment firm. And so they were
mm,
talking about, assets under management and all of these business KPIs. And, the vibe I got was like everyone was uber engaged. Like
mm,
they were very excited about these topics. Like they were taking lots of notes. They were kind of leaning in. Everybody was participating. Everybody had, contributions. And when it came time for my segment, the chief people officer kind of teed me up, and she said something to the effect of, "One of our goals this year is to increase employee engagement across the firm from
mm,
68 to 70." And there was like a very evident change in the environment as I'm just kind of like looking around and kind of seeing like how do people respond to that? How do they react to that? People were like kind of checking their phone, like they were multitasking. They seemed like they were kind of checking out. And it was then that I thought like what was like entering the HR domain like a grave mistake for my career because
mm,
they don't seem to take this very seriously. And so
mm,
I presented my segment. It went fine, not
mm,
great, but it went fine. And I went back to my desk and I was just kind of reflecting on this experience.
mm,
And I realized like I can't show up and give that same sort of presentation again because that did not
mm,
seem to land. Like I was not speaking uh, to them. I was not speaking in a language that really resonated with them. Like the CFO
mm,
cares about the financials and EBITDA and revenue and
mm,
margins, and the brokerage president cares about assets under management and net new accounts and all of these KPIs that they were going through. And then I show up and I'm talking about what they probably perceive to be this fluffy sort of like set of constructs of like employee engagement and people should be
mm,
happy. And they didn't see the connection with the business outcomes.
mhm,
And so, to that question around serving business outcomes, I really thought hard about that. And so leading people analytics, like I had access to like the entire, employee directory, like who's who. And I scoured the company to try to find out like who are those folks leading analytics in other parts of the organization, like business analytics and financial planning and analytics. And I reached out to all of them and I just said, my intention here is to like get to know you. Maybe there's some like data that would be mutually beneficial to like help, elevate the impact that each of our respective functions are having. And so I formed kind of this like collaborative of like, it was like a community of practice of analytics practitioners across the organization.
Mm.
And my hidden agenda was like, I want access to data that HR doesn't have, because I want to be
Mm.
able to tell a story that graduates beyond an
Mm.
employee engagement,
Yeah.
story, and one that talks about the impact that engagement has on the bottom line, on the organization's success.
Mm.
And so, TLDR, I got
Mm.
access to some of that data, and the next time I showed up, it went very differently. I was able to
Mm.
speak in the currency of money, in the language that they really wanted me to tell that story in.
That's great. It sounds like you're someone who's really concerned and driven by impact and wanting organizational success. I'm keen to hear too about how you connected the dots from the pe people analytics side to financial outcomes. How did you connect the dots for that audience?
Yeah, great question. So, kind of like a regression model when you can talk
Mm.
about, for every 1 unit increase
Mm.
in a predictor, the average change in the outcome is Y, right? And so, being able to correlate those data enabled me to tell a story like that. So, now I think to start, I picked a population because, outcomes at the individual level, of course, are going to vary based on a person's role and their level. It's very easy for like, people who are in like a sales capacity. Like we had in this particular, firm, we had like 500 brick and mortar facilities. These were people who were gathering assets. They were building relationships with
Mm.
folks in the community. And so we had like really hard quantifiable data on their productivity and performance. And so I started with that population because I knew like that was readily accessible. There were, sets of KPIs established that, were used to evaluate are we where we want to be from a financial performance perspective. And so I looked at that brokerage population, and by correlating engagement as well as the other factors that we were measuring on that survey to that data, I could tell a story about, well, engagement matters. And the reason we want to increase engagement is because for every 1 percentage point increase in engagement, the
Mm.
average lift we achieve in terms of assets under management is
Mm.
Y. And
Mm.
it's a favorable story. It's a positive story. And so that, no surprise, probably that landed much more effectively than just we picked an arbitrary 2 percentage point, lift, and we want to increase from 68 to 70 over the next year.
That's really helpful. So one of the ways that listening has an impact is through engagement. By through listening, you're able to demonstrate the value of increased engagement, and then business value. I'm curious if beyond engagement, if there are other paths from listening to business value to, is it primarily through engagement, increased engagement, or are there other outcomes that happen through employee listening?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I always start with well, number one, I think whether employee listening or people analytics, we're all in the business of change management ultimately. Like why do we conduct a survey? Why do we conduct a research project on an analytics team? Like it's ultimately to generate insights that lead to action. And that action is going to generate, meaningful change in the organization. So I think that's a helpful like prism or a helpful frame at the
Mm.
outset of any project or any survey design of like, what are we ultimately trying to achieve here? And I think what we're trying to achieve varies widely, right? It could be something like financial performance is kind of there's going to be a set of like indirect effects before we ultimately get to that outcome, right? It's like, engagement may not directly link to it, but engagement, leads to greater productivity, which leads to greater performance, and that performance leads to more financial impact, right? So there's kind of a chaining of different effects before we
Mm.
see the bottom line impact. But understanding the drivers of engagement enable us to, pull the right levers to influence that indirect effect and to facilitate success. So I think it I think it really just depends. One outcome that I've looked a lot at is regrettable attrition. So
Mm,
in HR parlance, that basically means people that we lose that we don't want to lose, right? These are people
mm,
who were regrettable losses. They had, outsized impact on the organization's success, versus involuntary or non-regrettable attrition, which are, folks that, maybe weren't working out or they made the decision and we didn't have to manage their performance, out of the organization. So I
mm.
think one really great thing about employee listening is that
Yeah,
a simple stay intentions item, like I plan to still be working for this organization 12 months from now or 2 years from now, whatever that time horizon is.
yeah.
In my experience, and I've done this across many organizations, that is the most powerful leading indicator of whether or not someone will actually leave.
Mm,
I mean, in some cases, if you look at, like I've looked at survival curves,
yeah.
kind of longitudinally, people who
Mm,
respond unfavorably to that leave at 20x a higher rate 6 months
mm,
later than people who respond favorably to that item. And I've definitely over-engineered this problem, in the past, trying to like create all these really complex features from the HRIS of like, tenure patterns and manager changes, and nothing outperforms the responses to that single survey item. I've actually used it for workforce planning
yeah.
applications in the past. Like, where can we expect elevated levels of churn so that like recruiters can staff up and, start thinking about how are we going to backfill all of those roles once that happens. And so long story short, there's a lot of different outcomes that we could explore, beyond, business outcomes and financial
Yeah.
performance that ultimately do influence the success of the organization in some way.
Thanks, Rick. That's really helpful. You've given us some leading indicators that we can tune into, for example, attrition, and how that matters. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sure.
and I love the framing of stay intentions versus leaving intentions because I know a lot of people are very hesitant to say that they honestly are going to leave, but if you're asking them about whether they're staying, there's like a little bit more leeway there. And so interesting that that's what you're finding. I think also I fully appreciate that you shared, uh your learnings over time of something that you've done when you were presenting the material and you framed it as just engagement and nothing leading to something that other people care about. But I'm curious if you can lean into that a little bit more. I'm curious, what are some of the practices or approaches or something you've seen organizations get wrong when it comes to how they're setting up and running their listening
Mm.
programs. That could be how they're collecting the data, how they're analyzing it, who they're listening to, how often they're listening to those people, and whether they're or how they're kind of closing the loop at the end, whether how they're sharing that it was received and integrated.
Yeah, I love that question. One thing I've seen organizations get wrong is kind of taking a more siloed approach to the design of the survey, rather than collaborating cross-functionally and getting input on like measurement themes and objectives. Because ultimately, like kind of going back to that frame of it's a change management exercise.
Mhm.
In what happens once we collect the data and we see some unfavorable scores on certain items, if like functional leaders aren't bought in that those are even the right questions to be asking, or we're not willing or able to influence scores should they be unfavorable, then it's like, why did we ask those questions to begin with, right? Like that's just I think a helpful first step of what are we willing and able to influence. And then let's let that kind of guide our survey item selection and what we ultimately choose to measure on the survey. But I think that requires a cross-functional kind of committee of voices, because if there are, big functional areas that are not represented, for example, like the last three companies I've worked at have been tech companies, and engineering is a no surprise, very important function in those companies. And if engineering didn't have a voice, if they weren't asked to contribute some ideas around what we might think about measuring, number one, they're probably like leaders in that function probably won't go out of their way to encourage people to participate while the survey's live. Um, and two, once the survey completes, they're probably not going to be very invested in moving the needle on these items that they weren't a part of selecting in the first place. And so I just think, one of the biggest challenges, but probably the most important components of any employee listening program is doing the hard work of getting that cross-functional group of voices and input from the outset and making sure that people see themselves in the survey. When they go to take it, they had an opportunity to provide their input, based on all my experiences in this function and kind of what friction we're seeing or what opportunities we're seeing. I'd really like a pulse on these things because that sort of like, no pun intended, but that sort of engagement in the process of building a survey that, measures engagement among other things, is critically important to actually driving action and driving that commitment to moving the needle once the survey completes.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense, and that's something you see a lot, right? Like where it's kind of like top-down driven, where they're saying like, "Hey, here's what we need to measure," or "Here's just what we've measured last year," and we just need to kind of keep those benchmarks the same, and without feeling like it's related to them and that there's any input from their side. They also probably just check out, don't take it, don't care, dishonest, just a whole range of things. Do you see any issues with kind of the nitty-gritty of like how often or how it's interpreted or any or who they're listening to? Do you ever see that as being an issue, or you think it's more just the input into the survey?
Yeah, I think it can be both. I've seen a range of like appetites, I would say,
Mhm.
for, more frequent pulses and what those pulses look, the extent to which they're seen as like really credible sources of information that we can action on. Um, one recent company I was with, when I joined the organization, there was an operations function that was really passionate about employee engagement. They had a quarterly pulse that they were driving. They had like task forces spun up around it. I mean, they were really committed and engaged, and like that's always a great like signal. Like how can we like how can we get others on board to like take this stuff as seriously as they do? But then there's other functions where it's like, what, do we have to take a survey? Like, is this something that like is this like a mandate or can we just take a pass? Can you exclude our function? They just like saw no value in it whatsoever. And so I think people are in different places, and that could be informed by, prior experiences with a listening, program elsewhere, or it could be like I've seen meaningful change come from this, or I've seen highlighted, significant opportunities that I would otherwise have missed had we not done this. And so I think you got to do some selling in the early days, is my experience, right? Like some will be on board. I would say in most cases, if there's no listening program, most will not be on board. We've got to sell them on the benefits to doing this. It's kind of like when you build a startup and you have, just maybe it's like you and your co-founder, or just like a handful of people. You don't need a listening program to know how things are going because you're talking all the time, multiple times a day. You can quickly ascertain, from day to day if like, well, something seems off today. Like they don't seem like they're in a good place. Like you pick up on those things. But as a company grows and scales, to dozens and hundreds and especially thousands of people, that's no longer possible. Just like walking around the halls and like, the water cooler talk, and you can't keep a pulse on everyone. But, as the organization becomes increasingly complex, everyone has ideas. Everyone sees like, hey, like that could be improved, but I'm not going to speak up because maybe I think it's like not my place or it's above my pay grade or I might step on someone's toes. They built that process, and if I challenge it, maybe they think that I'm trying to like come for their there's all sorts of like dynamics that play into that psychological safety and like are people like open to like other ideas. And so I think it's really important that, organizations, once they reach a certain size, have a program like this so that you can capture the voice of all employees and you capture their
Mhm.
ideas, their perspectives, and people want to be heard. People want that forum in which to submit their ideas and also, what's maybe not going so well in the organization.
Yeah, I mean, people definitely want that forum. I think I wonder if there's a challenge of getting people to actually want to use the listening platform or the listening tools available to actually do it. So I am just curious about if you could lean a little bit more into how to actually close the loop after, we've collected this data, we kind of have our insights internally. Just thinking about how important it is or not, how much do you have to communicate out versus can you just do the action internally and make the changes? What's kind of important there to be mindful of?
Yeah, I think I might put this in the camp too of like what some organizations get wrong.
Mhm.
One thing is like with respect to like the top-down action planning protocol, where it's like we look at the company-wide opportunities, we pick one or two, and we ask everyone to create action plans around this. Often managers begin to wonder, well, but those aren't the opportunities I see in my dashboard that like my people are dealing with. And so I'm taking action on this other thing that we're actually doing quite well on relative to these other opportunity areas. And so I think, some blend of like enterprise level and like local, like again, like one, maybe two items
Mm.
makes that a bit more relevant. Because if people believe that they're already doing well on it based on the scores, the relative scores, but they're being required to action on this because it's an opportunity at the company level, while kind of ignoring like these other like glaring opportunity areas that they would really like to focus on, people aren't going to be too motivated by that. But I think if we can blend and say like each manager like pick one of your opportunity areas that you're committed to moving the needle on, create an action plan around that, and really think about what it would look like to make some real progress on those. All the while we have maybe something that senior leadership is like really capable of taking action on, like a company-wide policy or a company strategy wasn't clearly communicated. Like that's something that's clearly for like senior leadership, but managers, again, where that survey item reference is like my manager or my team, like that's feedback for the manager. Like that's like something specific to them and their team and the way they function. And so I think it's, we've got to make sure that it's relevant to each manager and that they're taking action on things that are really going to improve the life of folks on their team.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because I know we often think about like, you must close the loop, you must do something. But if that something is just taking like the thing that came out on top of the survey and isn't a priority for your group, then you're not really translating or doing something that's meaningful. You're just doing action. So I really appreciate that insight.
Yeah, and just one more thing to add to that too. Sometimes it's as simple as closing the loop by communicating that we heard you and here's what we heard. I've seen so many times where managers haven't done that and they get busy or maybe they don't feel comfortable representing the results. Maybe they don't, that they're fearful that if people ask questions about it, they won't have an answer, they don't understand it well enough. But at the very least, when employees participate in a survey, they expect that there's going to be some communication back to them on here's what we heard and here's what you can expect with regard to next steps around how we're going to take action and improve those things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important because you can't do everything, right? So even if something is
Yep.
great for the team, if it's not possible, even just sharing like, hey, we heard you. We heard exactly what you said. We're going to, it might be longer term, it might be not in the near future, it might not be possible, but we hear you and we appreciate your feedback. I could see how that could be really meaningful.
Yeah. Thanks, Craig. That's a really powerful listening principle just to validate what someone hears. It may lead to action, may not, but that itself is a form of closing the loop. I'm really interested in something you said earlier too, which I think is quite important. You gave the example of how listening changes as you move from like two co-founders to a startup to a larger organization, and you mentioned something that a listening program is needed as an organization scales. We're quite interested in how this shifts for organizations and how listening programs or listening strategy shifts from listening within a team to listening across teams to listening in a large in the organizations that you worked with, large distributed organizations. How does that shift? Could you speak more about the challenge of scale and how considerations on how listening approaches changes as organizations grow in scale?
Yeah, I think it varies widely based on the company and the industry, but I think that the number one thing that I would recommend is, make sure that the cadence and the design of the program is consistent with your capacity and willingness to drive action. It does no good to ask like a set of weekly questions or launch like a weekly pulse if like we can't do anything like more often than like twice a year, right? And
Mm,
so it's not necessarily that like more surveys or more listening moments are better. It's really like what is what is the right tempo for those listening moments,
mm,
and what can we realistically do in response to them?
mm,
Certainly I wouldn't advocate for like an act like a full-fledged action planning cycle on the heels of each. Like it might be we action once a year, and then all of the other listening moments are really just kind of a pulse check to see for those areas that we are trying to move the needle on, are we seeing some shift? Are we seeing like new emerging opportunities, based on recent events like company restructuring or external factors that we might need to address in the meantime, and we don't want to wait a year to find out that these were emerging risks and issues and we didn't know about it because we weren't asking these questions. But I just think it's really important for the organization to consider what is right for them, in light of all the other competing priorities that exist in every company. What's the right tempo for them, and what are they willing and able to take action on?
That's great. Yeah, so considering the tempo of the listening rather than just more listening is always better. How do we sequence listening? Related to this with around more and the tempo of listening, one thing that we're really interested to hear your thoughts on is something that's front of mind for many people is artificial intelligence, large language models, and how it's changing the way we make sense in organizations. And clearly, it has some implications for organizational listening too. So we're just keen to hear how you're grappling with this and thinking about the role of AI in employee listening.
Yeah, such an exciting topic. I have long felt that the employee listening industry was in significant need of disruption.
Mm,
The employee survey as we know it today hasn't really evolved much. I think employee surveys started back in like the 1910s, early 20th century as like the employee attitude survey in industrial companies. It evolved somewhat to look at like communication and leadership and culture and like some other dimensions of life in the organization. But fundamentally, the survey itself hasn't changed all that much. And when I juxtapose that reality against how significantly work has changed in organizations, especially in light of AI, people aren't just collaborating with humans anymore. They're collaborating with agents. They're operating agents, swarms of agents. And like that really fundamentally changes the experience. And I think how we should think about listening. So that's like observation number one. I would say, AI does have a lot of promising applications for employee listening. I think a lot about like qualitative analysis, going back to those focus groups that we were talking about, kind of a multi-channel listening strategy. That's kind of an obvious way of like taking all of this unstructured data, all of this textual data, and open into comments, in making sense of it, detecting patterns. What are the topics that emerge? What's the sentiment for each of those? How connected are those different topics? What are the relationships among them? That's something that we can easily do today with AI that at least when I was in grad school, I remember going through like, classes about open coding and like, oh my goodness, like what a daunting and also very subjective process because you give that same exercise to another researcher, they might come up with an entirely different story based on that. And so not that AI is perfect at it, but I think I much prefer this over kind of those very manual coding exercises.
Yeah.
So so there's that. I also think just kind of thinking about how to re-architect a survey or like to evolve the survey. I've been thinking a lot lately, and I don't have any specific case studies to offer on this right now, but the idea of like conversational listening. And so, whether we call that like an always on, feedback survey or channel, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a survey, but this idea that, we prompt an employee and it's adaptive. So based on the feedback they supply, we start asking follow-up questions to like double click into aspects of their feedback and understand more. In some cases, their response may be initially ambiguous and unclear as to what they're referring to, but through a series of back and forth interactions with the agent, you can learn more. I actually think for scalable digital focus groups, this has a lot of practical utility because you would no longer need like an HRBP in the loop to like facilitate live focus groups. You could, I'm just making this up if it's, psychological safety that emerged as an opportunity on the employee survey and we want to dive deeper in a particular part of the organization and learn more about what underpins that, this sort of conversational listening to gain deeper qualitative context about what the drivers of that may be could have a lot of potential.
Mhm. So you're seeing with AI, the technology is able to engage in these kind of conversational listening, um, rather than, and so that's a leap above just the traditional surveys that we often use in employee listening. One of the challenges with AI adoption, or a question often is like, what's the role of the human now? If we have conversational agents, AI both asking the question and processing the data. What do you see as the role of the human in the employee listening process?
Yeah, I have so many conversations with folks in people analytics about this of like if people or if AI can be used to automate a lot of the back end kind of plumbing, the data pipelines and the aggregations and integration and transformation of data, even dashboards, are becoming like really don't need people to do that today. What is the role of a human in a people analytics team? And we can ask the same thing for employee listening. As I think about kind of the first part of that, number one, it's asking great questions, being curious, leaning in with key stakeholders across the organization to translate their business anecdotes into testable hypotheses, on which we can bring data and analytics to bear. I think that's really critical because like what questions do we ask on a survey? Like when and where and to whom and how often do we launch something like a conversational listening bot, right? Those are all questions that are informed by the initial questions that we have and the hypotheses that we have and what we're willing and able to take action on, which requires business context and really understanding kind of the state of things within the organization. So that's kind of like um, on the left side, on the tail end of analyses, after we've collected the data, we've analyzed the data, what do we do about it? I still think that's largely a human in the loop. We can talk about like behavioral economics and nudges and I think there is some utility, especially in like knowledge worker settings, to help people like nudge them on like reviewing the results, nudge them on like, hey, just a reminder, last we saw these were opportunities when you're going into these one-on-ones or these team meetings. Here's some things to think about. I think that can be productive, as long as it doesn't become like noise and like, Teams or Slack or email, and it's just like more pings, more things to do. It could be noisy pretty quickly. But barring that, I think there still has to be a human that's like guiding that transformation effort, that change effort. Otherwise, I think, all these digital signals that we're all inundated with every day can just become, quickly overwhelming. And
Mm-hmm.
then that means nothing happens. Like it's just these nudges
Mm-hmm.
are just seen as like more pings, more to-dos. I'm a busy manager. I don't have time for that. And so I resort back to like my old ways of working and nothing changes. And then the cycle repeats itself. We ask for people to participate in another survey, but they didn't see change happen between the last one and this one. Why would they participate again? And so it can be kind of a spiraling effect of like participation drops, people become cynical about it. The
Yeah.
program doesn't have much impact.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there has to be a human both on the kind of the initial, what is it that we're here to achieve? What do we need to think about? What do we need to know? And
Yeah.
then on the other side, how do we walk with people and partner with people and coach
Great.
them on, making small yet measurable steps in the right direction?
Thanks, Greg. That's a great, good relief too. There's a role for us and our listeners in this listening process, employee listening, listening strategy, organizational change. Thank
Yeah, I'm so curious about how things are going to be shifting over time because I think we're probably going to see a very different world coming up of how we are working with, not against, not trying to stop the change from happening, but really managing with it. And the concept you brought up of being able to probe, I mean, how many times have we given out surveys, looked at the results, and been like, I have no idea why. Now we need to do a focus group. But also there was a focus group and talking to people just to figure out the survey questions. And you're kind of going back and forth and it's taking a long time to make a change because you can't figure out what everything is, what we need to be measuring, and how everybody then feels about it, right? So that definitely could make a big difference. But I do want to shift gears a little bit. We've talked now about what these traditional surveys have looked like, right? Someone's choosing to, okay, fine, I'll answer the survey. It's usually a sample, there's some kind of structure, gathered from time to time like the engagement survey that you're used to saying once or twice a year, your platform, OrgAcuity, you're doing something very different, right? You're using organizational network analysis. Can you walk us through, what you're measuring and how it's different than what we're traditionally used to in our normal surveys?
Yeah, absolutely. So organizational network analysis, for those who may not be familiar, it's basically a way of constructing a view of the organization that reflects how work actually happens. Like irrespective of where you sit on an org chart or, what demographics you may or may not share with others, with respect to like job profile, location, tenure band, and others. These networks, these like communities of collaboration, these reflect, who you lean on for your success, who you interact with every day. And those people, to a large degree, influence your experience, right? I mean, I often use the example before I got into HR, I spent about a decade in engineering. I worked in very technical roles, and in all of those roles, I didn't really work a whole lot with people who shared my manager, and I didn't work with my manager all that much. I worked in like these agile squads and guilds, which are like horizontal work constructs that were comprised of like a project manager, a product owner, a data analyst, a data engineer. And these people all had different managers. They, in many cases, rolled up to different parts of the organization, might have been like products, some engineering. But these are the people I spent my time with. And when I thought about my team, like for all intents and purposes, this was my team, right? And these were the people who influenced my experience. If I, had some sort of like friction or disagreement with folks, in that squad, that impacted my experience, right? It didn't matter that they weren't, sitting on my formal team as classified in the HRIS. And so and just share kind of the genesis story here. When I was at MasterCard, I had a really, I had a significant people analytics team. I think we had like 30 plus people on the team. And so very specialized roles. We have data engineering, data management, data science, business intelligence. We had all sorts of specialized pillars. And MasterCard, at least at the time, acquired a lot of companies. So like M&A was just kind of like BAU. It's like business as usual. What are we acquiring? A lot of new like payments technology companies. And I was often asked to help leadership understand how well we were assimilating these acquired folks into the broader MasterCard ecosystem. So kind of a longitudinal look. And so like, are they more and more over time functioning like part of the broader MasterCard, ecosystem, or do they still operate like a disparate kind of independent entity? And I was very intrigued by that question because basically leadership was asking me to kind of put the org chart aside. Like we had to put the acquired folks somewhere to pay them to manage their performance, but we knew they weren't actually working that way.
Mm.
And so, we were feeding over this, HRIS data to our employee listening platform. And that was all predicated on people working within these neat, tidy boxes on an org chart. And like that's how all the reporting was designed. Like you get like these manager reports and you see experience through that lens. Then you get a heat map of people who share the same demographics. Here's a, cut by job profile and by location and by department. But as I took a step back and I was kind of reminiscing on my days, within a technical set of squads and guilds, I thought, why are we only looking at experience for acquired folks through the lens of networks? Why don't we look at everyone that way? Because you look at like go-to-market teams, right? They're comprised of like marketing and sales and product and engineering, and maybe you've got a finance person in there. They don't have anything in common, different departments, different managers, but that is a group of people who have been assembled to achieve some common goal. And so I took a look at this. We were partnering with a big four consulting firm for like the active organizational network analysis studies. And basically those are just surveys that have questions like who do you leverage for subject matter expertise, or who do you go to get unblocked when you're stuck, or who provides you like career coaching and guidance. Like these could be any number of questions based on what's relevant to the organization. um, so it's like we had these surveys sitting over here with our consulting firm. Then we had these surveys that we were launching in our listening platform for employee engagement and other dimensions of the employee experience. Like, but they're all surveys. Why can't we just stitch them together in one platform and just like overlay the sentiments on top of these networks, these communities of collaboration that organically emerge across the organization? Um, and so as I thought about this, I thought this probably has really promising applications for taking action as well, because I even knew like myself as a people manager, I was being asked to take action on things that I couldn't actually influence, right? Like I can influence things where the survey item referent is my manager, my team. Senior leaders can influence company strategy and company-wide policies, but what about everything in between? Like psychological safety and burnout and collaboration on every other dimension of the employee experience that we're measuring on these surveys, managers can influence that. And I often heard from senior leaders, well, HR is going to fix that. HR is going to own that. It's like, well, HR can't influence that. That's much bigger than HR. Like we've got to take a more novel approach to this. And so as I started getting more and more acquainted with organizational network analysis, I thought, number one, this is very easy to implement because there's active and passive. Like the passive is of course where you're mining digital exhaust like chat logs and emails and calendars, and that's dead on arrival in a lot of companies. Like the idea of like it's going to be perceived as corporate spyware and big brother optics, and people don't like the creepy stuff, right? And so like there's some companies that do that, and it certainly has value, but the active survey based O&A was very intriguing because there's not the technical complexity of implementing something like that. And two, you can just embed those network-based questions into the surveys you're already launching, right? It's like 3 to 5 questions, like name up to 5 people per question that you would leverage for your success across these different dimensions. And then you can also control for the effects of time. Like if you launch 2 disparate surveys, then you have to wonder, like, did something change between one and the next? But you control for time by embedding those network-based questions into your existing employee experience surveys. But then you have the benefit of overlaying these sentiments on top of these communities that would otherwise be missed, right? These communities of collaboration, these networks, these informal work groups, these are not cataloged anywhere in the HRIS. And so, if we look only at people who like have like the same shared demographics or who share the same manager, we're going to miss these groups where maybe people are really burnt out. People in this group are really burnt out. Life is not going well in the organization. They're at high risk of leaving the organization. And when you kind of pull out each member and you park them in like, well, let's, look at people with that same job or that same location, you miss those hot spots. Because in aggregate, across people who share the same dimensions, it may not look like there's an issue. But when you view life through the lens of how people actually work day in and day out, who they leverage for their success, it becomes really interesting.
So are you using, so you get the results, right? Are you using it more to look at what these actual clusters of work look like? Are you using it to pinpoint these are the people that are actually holding all the advice or the influence for people so I can, use them to make a change? Like, how are you actually implementing and using that data?
Yeah, but we do both actually. And so, as I reflected on that MasterCard situation, I realized not every company has the luxury of a 30-person people analytics team to do something like this, launch some active O&A surveys, and then like stitch that together with their employee listening data. But I saw so much value in it. So, that was the impetus. Across 2020, we spent 2020 building our MVP. We had our first paying customer in early 2021. But my goal was to bring that capability to every organization, even small companies that may not have any people analytics team. And so yes, we do both. We can look at it through the lens of like who are the key influencers. A really common one right now is AI enablement. That there's some like,
Hmm.
in certain organizations, there are some like key people who they're like notorious for bringing back learnings to the team. Like, hey, I experimented with this new model or this like new agentic approach, and here's the results it yielded, and like here's how you can apply that to your context. And so people get in the habit of like, well, I need access to that person because like they're on the cutting edge of like advancements in this field. Um, and so you can look at it through the lens of, well, those people that others lean on are very influential and very important. But it's also a risk because if you see all of these incoming ties, all of these incoming connections where people are saying, I need that person to be successful. I need that person to accomplish my work objectives. That person's probably overwhelmed. That person's probably burnt out. That's like probably should think about like a way to de-risk that and kind of federate that knowledge across the organization so others like it's not a single point of failure. Others have the knowledge that others can lean on, and you can start to scale that. So, I think there's a couple of different stories, at least a couple of different stories that you can tell by identifying like who are those key influencers that emerge.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I also know like there's been tremendous, people don't think about the impact of contagion and things spreading, right? And what that looks like. But then you see outside research on it, right? They've done huge studies on obesity, and smoking, right? And about how the people that you're interacting with have such a big influence on you. So when you start looking at things in terms of networks and structure, there's really so much more that you can gather and learn from that. So it's fascinating that you're able to integrate both, thinking about that and thinking about the cons of people weighing too heavily on those core influencers and how to support them so that they're able to do what they need to do, but without kind of impacting them.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned contagion because in traditional listening platforms, like all feedback is created equal in terms of like its effect. And of course, every piece of feedback is important. Everyone's voice is important. But if you start to kind of weight the analysis based on the relative influence it has based on their position in the network, you can start to predict the likelihood that that sentiment is going to spread. So if you have someone who is like really bought in with like a leadership change or a reorg or whatever might be happening inside the company, and they're really central in the organization, a lot of people are leaning on them for their success. Good luck influencing that at scale, right? Because their negative sentiments are likely to influence the perspectives of others versus someone who's on the periphery and they're relatively disconnected, their sentiments are going to be relatively contained and isolated. And so that's one thing that we do with OrgAcuity too, by embedding the networks and employee listening, we have like influence adjusted analytics where you can anticipate whether it's quantitative or it's qualitative, what's the propensity of that sentiment to spread, so what to influence and who to activate to move the needle on those.
Hmm. It's really
Craig,
cool. Wow.
yeah, that's quite fascinating. This notion of like you're listening into relational patterns. You're listening into what's happening between people, not just within a person. And that really expands the space of employee listening beyond just sentiments, engagement. I'm mindful of your time too, and I think our listeners would want to know like how can they engage in your work? What resources might you have to suggest? How could folks connect with you and the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. I love to share kind of what we're doing and what I'm learning along the way. OrgAcuity.com. Feel free to check out our site. We've got some videos, some product videos, some more information there. But yeah, would love to engage if you're interested in kind of how to evolve employee listening and kind of what the intersection of organizational network analysis in employee listening looks like and kind of the utility it has for change management and organizations. Would love to connect.
Okay,
Thanks.
amazing. Well, thank you so much for your insights today. We have so many more questions to ask you, but
Mhm.
yes, definitely want to be mindful of your time. And, this has been so rich and insightful, and I think we've gotten so much for it. So we really appreciate it. And, for anyone listening, we really welcome your thoughts and perspectives. So please add your input in the comments and stay tuned for upcoming interviews with other listening experts for additional insights. So thank you so much again, Craig.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, Craig. Great.